What you are about to hear is a story that has been locked inside a publisher's vault in New York for 3 months. A story that the palace has been desperately trying to prevent from reaching the public. A story that makes Spare look like a children's book, because Harry wrote about what happened to him, but Meghan has written about what happened to all of them. And the difference between those two things is the difference between a window and a door. Hello friends, my name is James, and you are watching Royal Daily Report, your #1 source for the most exclusive and most shocking royal stories on the internet. If you are new here, hit that subscribe button right now, because tonight we are telling a story that every royal watcher on the planet has been waiting for, without knowing it was coming. And if you have been with us from the beginning, you already know. We never hold back. We never pull back. Let us get into it. The book exists. That is the first thing our source wanted us to know. Not a rumor, not a project in development, not something being considered or discussed or negotiated. A finished book, 387 pages, written entirely by Meghan in her own hand over a period of 2 years. Revised, edited, fact-checked, legally reviewed, ready, sitting in a publisher's office in New York with a publication date that has been set and a title that our source says will be the most talked about title in publishing history the moment it is announced, and a set of revelations inside it that our source, a person who has read significant portions of the manuscript, who came to us at enormous personal risk, who has spent 3 months deciding whether to speak, describes as the most honest and most devastating thing any member of the royal world has ever committed to paper. Spare was Harry's story, written with a ghostwriter, shaped by the particular way Harry processes things, emotionally, impulsively, with the specific rawness of someone who spent decades not processing and then processed everything at once. Harry's book was the book of a man who had been hurt and who needed the world to know he had been hurt. And it was powerful, and it was important, and it changed the conversation, but it was also, in the ways that matter most, incomplete. Because Harry could only tell what Harry knew, could only see what Harry saw, could only understand what Harry was able to understand about the institution and the family and the forces that shaped both of them. And Harry, for all his courage in writing what he wrote, was still in many ways a man who loved his family, who wanted his family to be better than it was, who wrote about them with the complicated mixture of anger and love and longing that made Spare both devastating and, in places, restrained. Meghan does not have the same restraint. Our source says the book, which Meghan has been working on since late 2023, which she wrote in the early mornings before her children woke up, which she revised alone without showing anyone the full manuscript until it was complete, is structured in 4 parts, and each part is more significant than the last. Part 1 covers Meghan's life before Harry, her childhood, her parents, her career, her first marriage, the life she built and the person she became before any of this happened. And our source says this section contains things that Meghan has never said publicly about her own history, about her father, about what her childhood was actually like behind the public narrative, about the person she was before the world decided who she was. Things that are personal and honest, and in some places painful, in ways that have nothing to do with the royal family. Just a woman telling the truth about where she came from. And our source says, this section alone would be enough to make the book significant. But it is only the beginning. Part 2 covers the relationship with Harry and the entry into the royal world. And this is where our source says the book begins to reveal things that nobody has fully understood before. Because Meghan writes about the period between their engagement and their wedding, with a specificity and a detail that goes far beyond anything in the Netflix documentary or any interview she has given. She writes about specific conversations, specific meetings, specific moments where she was told things by specific people in specific rooms that shaped everything that came after. She names names. Not all of them, but enough. Our source says there is a chapter in Part 2 about a meeting that took place in late 2017, before the wedding, before the engagement was even officially announced, between Meghan and a senior palace figure whose identity our source confirms, but asks us not to reveal tonight. A meeting in which Meghan was told, with a clarity that she describes as shocking in its directness, what the institution expected of her, what she would be required to give up, what parts of herself, her voice, her opinions, her public identity, her connections to her own past, were considered incompatible with the role she was being asked to step into. And Meghan writes that she sat in that meeting and smiled, and said the right things and walked out, and stood in a corridor alone for several minutes before she could move, because she had just been told, in the most polite and institutional language imaginable, to disappear, to become a function rather than a person, to trade herself for a title, and she had smiled and nodded and said thank you, and she has spent 7 years carrying the weight of that smile. Part 3 is the section that our source says the palace is most frightened of, because Part 3 covers the years inside the institution, the years between the wedding and the departure, and Meghan writes about those years with the particular clarity of someone who has spent a long time processing what happened, and who is now, finally, ready to say all of it. She writes about racism, not in the abstract language of the Oprah interview, in the specific, documented, named language of someone who kept records, who wrote things down, who saved messages, who has evidence. Our source says there are passages in Part 3 that contain direct quotes from communications that Meghan received during her time in the royal world. Communications that she has preserved, that her legal team has reviewed, that are, according to our source, the kind of evidence that makes lawyers sit very still and read very carefully. She writes about her mental health crisis with a rawness that goes beyond anything she has said publicly, about specific days, specific moments, specific things that were said to her and not said to her, and done and not done, that pushed her to the place she has spoken about obliquely in interviews, but never fully described. She describes that place in Part 3 with a precision and a nuance, honesty, that our source says made them put the manuscript down several times because they could not continue reading without needing a moment to absorb what they had just read. And she writes about William. Our source says the William chapters in Part 3 are the most significant thing in the entire book. Not because they are cruel. They are not cruel. Meghan does not write about William with cruelty. She writes about him with something more uncomfortable than cruelty. She writes about him with understanding. With the specific understanding of someone who has watched a person clearly and completely, and who sees both what that person is and what that person could have been. She describes William's role in what happened to her, not as villainy, but as something more ordinary and more damaging than villainy, as the abdication of someone who had the power to make things different, and who chose, consistently and deliberately and without ever fully acknowledging the choice, not to use that power, who watched and did not act, who knew and did not speak, who had a brother who needed him, and who had a system that needed him more, and who chose the system. Every time, in ways large and small and sometimes so subtle that she was not sure, in the moment, whether she was imagining it, but that she is not imagining now, that she has documented, that she is ready to put on record. Part 4 is the section our source finds most surprising, because Part 4 is not about the royal family at all. Part 4 is about what came after, about California, about building a life, about Harry, about the children, about the American Riviera orchard brand, and what it represents, and why Meghan built it the way she built it, about the specific vision she has for the rest of her life. And our source says Part 4 is the most hopeful thing Meghan has ever produced publicly. Not naive hopeful, not performing hopeful, genuinely, grounded, hard-won hopeful. The hope of someone who has been through the worst version of what they feared, and who has come out the other side, and who is standing in the sunshine in California with 2 children, and a husband, and a brand, and a voice that belongs entirely to her, and who is, for the first time in years, simply and quietly and powerfully at peace. Part 4 is Meghan telling the world, I survived, not despite everything, because of everything, because every hard thing taught me something, because every closed door pushed me toward the right open one, because the life I have now is not the consolation prize for the life I lost. It is the life I was always supposed to have, and I would not trade it, for anything. Not for a palace, not for a title, not for any of it. Harry has read the complete manuscript. Our source says Harry was the first person outside Meghan's core team to read it, that she gave it to him on a Saturday morning, and he read it in one sitting, spent the entire day reading it, while she took Archie and Lilibet to the park. And when she came home, he was sitting at the kitchen table with the manuscript in front of him, and he had been crying, not sad crying, Our source says Meghan described it to a close friend as the particular crying that happens when someone finally says out loud the thing that you have both been carrying alone for years, and you realize you did not have to carry it alone, and the relief of that is almost unbearable. Harry looked at her when she came through the door and he said, "You said all of it. You said every single thing." And she said, "Was that wrong?" And he said, "It was the rightest thing you have ever done. Publish it. Publish every word." The palace became aware of the book's existence approximately 6 weeks ago. Our source says the reaction inside those walls was immediate and significant. Legal teams were assembled, advisors were briefed. The question of whether there were grounds to seek an injunction to prevent publication before it happened was seriously explored. And the answer that came back from the legal team was not what certain people inside the palace wanted to hear. The answer was no, that Meghan had been careful, that her legal team had been thorough, that the book was, in the assessment of the palace's own lawyers, legally defensible, that the specific things Meghan had documented and the way she had documented them and the evidence she had preserved meant that seeking an injunction would be both unlikely to succeed and likely to generate exactly the kind of coverage that would make everything worse. The palace was told to prepare for the book's publication, not to fight it, to prepare for it. And our source says the process of that preparation, the conversations happening inside those walls right now about what is coming and what it will mean and how to respond, is the most significant institutional crisis the palace has faced since the death of Diana. Charles knows about the book. Our source says Charles was briefed personally, was told the broad outlines of what it contains, was told about the William chapters specifically. And our source says Charles's reaction was not what people might expect, was not anger, was not the cold institutional response of a monarch protecting his family, was something quieter. Was the reaction of a sick man who has spent 3 years trying to find a way back to a son and a daughter-in-law, and who has just been told that the daughter-in-law has written 387 pages about why the way back is so hard to find. Our source says Charles sat with that information for a long time, and then he said something that his aide wrote down because it seemed important. He said, "She is not wrong. About any of it. She is not wrong. And whatever this costs us, whatever the publication of this book costs this family and this institution, we brought it on ourselves. Every page of it. We brought it on ourselves. William has not been officially briefed on the book's contents. Our source says the decision was made not to tell William specifically what the William chapters contain, that he knows the book exists, knows it is coming, but does not know exactly what Meghan has written about him. And our source says that uncertainty, that not knowing, is something that people close to William say is affecting him in ways that are visible to those around him, that he is carrying the weight of not knowing what is coming, of waiting, of understanding that somewhere in 387 pages there are words about him that will be read by millions of people, and that he cannot see, and cannot prepare for, and cannot respond to until they are already public. Our source says that uncertainty is the most uncomfortable thing William has experienced in years, and that Meghan, who spent years not knowing what was being said about her in rooms she was not in, who spent years on the wrong side of that particular uncertainty, has not done this deliberately, but also has not lost sleep over it. The publication date has not been officially announced. Our source believes it is coming within the next 3 months, that the machinery of publication is already in motion, that the title will be announced first, then the cover, then the excerpts will begin to appear, and then the world will have access to 387 pages of Meghan Markle telling the truth completely. For the first time, in her own words, without an interviewer shaping the questions, without a ghostwriter mediating the language, without a producer deciding what lands and what gets left on the cutting room floor, just Meghan and the truth. And 387 pages that are going to change the conversation about the royal family, about race, about power, about what it means to be a woman in a world that wants to decide who you are before you have had a chance to decide yourself, for a very long time. Our source said one final thing before they ended our conversation. They said, "I have read a lot of books about powerful people telling their stories. I have read memoirs that were brave, and memoirs that were strategic, and memoirs that were both at the same time. And I want to tell you something about this one that I have not been able to say about very many others. This book is true. Not just factually true, emotionally true, spiritually true, in the way that writing is true when the person writing it is not performing, and not managing, and not calculating the effect of every sentence. When they are simply telling you what happened, and what it felt like, and what it cost, and what it gave back. This book is Meghan Markle being completely honest, in a way she has never been able to be completely honest before. And that honesty, that complete, unguarded, radical honesty, is going to reach people in a way that nothing she has done before has reached them. Not because of who she is, because of who we all are, because every person who reads this book is going to find something in it that is their story too. Not the royal parts, not the palace parts, the human parts, the parts about being told to disappear and smiling and saying thank you, the parts about carrying something alone for too long, the parts about finding your way to the life you were supposed to have after losing the life you thought you wanted. Every person who has ever done any version of those things is going to read this book and feel seen, and that is not something you can suppress with a legal team, or manage with a palace statement, or wait out with institutional patience. That is something that lands, and stays, and changes things, permanently. The book is coming, and nothing is going to stop it. That is all for tonight, friends. I am James, and this has been Royal Daily Report. If this story hit different for you tonight, hit that like button right now, subscribe if you have not already, and turn on those notifications, because we are going to be covering every single development in this story, from the title announcement, to the cover reveal, to the first excerpts, to publication day itself. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. I will see you in the next one. Until then, stay informed, stay curious, and stay royal. Goodbye, friends.